Jai Hind and welcome to Dev Talks. This is Aadi. The Indian defense budget, although the events in Ukraine have overshadowed any and every conversation about the defense budget, India's national security, and so on and so forth for the past at least a week. But I thought we kind of revisit this entire thing. And as you all can see, I have with me Lieutenant General Anil Ahuja, who's after about 39 years of long service with the Indian Army, who was the former Deputy Chief of the Integrated Defense Staff, and today is a senior adjunct fellow of the Delhi Policy Group, is joining me to take us through the defense budget, couple of misperceptions about the defense budget, and actually to decipher what exactly does it mean and what kind of focus are we looking at in the next couple of years. Thank you, General Sir, for joining me today for this very interesting and enlightening conversation, if I may say so.
Thanks, Aadi. Pleasure being with you.
Sir, I'd like to just add a little bit. So, the defense budget has come into vogue. One of the things is because of the security threats which are happening, and currently with, as I said, the Russia-Ukraine crisis, we see a whole new requirement of India's national security being strong enough, looking at the factor that we're facing almost 2.5 fronts in terms of a war. To that end, I think everybody would understand and agree that capability building is something that India needs to do. We are working towards it. The speed and this and that can be debated. Everybody would have his own opinion. The warfare, as we've seen, again, Ukraine has gone into different domains, land, sea and air, of course, but there is information warfare that we see which is being played out on the battlefield very, very well in Ukraine, especially from the Ukrainian side. And of course, cyber, electromagnetic, space, and so on and so forth. This capability, of course, costs money. And, that is what I'm here with the General to discuss about, because money is something that we need to look at, because India is not a super rich country that it could just dump money into defense. That is one of the arguments. And it is also, it can't reduce the expenditure into defense because of the threats that I mentioned. So, sir, to begin with, what are the highlights of this year's budget that you see which are significant in your eyes? And I'd like you to just throw a little light in comparison with the previous years.
Okay, Adi, just to set the backdrop for our discussion, very broadly, the overall allocation this year has been about 5.25 lakh crores, about $72 billion, as against about 4.8 lakh crores last year. Now, this is 9.8% increase and is just over 2% of India's GDP. However, if we set aside the allocations that have been made for pensions, what we have for defense per se is 4 lakh crores or about $55.5 billion. That is for the core defense. And this constitutes 1.6% of the GDP. It was nearly the same last year, 1.59, 1.63, but it's hovering in the region of 1.6% of the GDP. So, the pattern for last 3 years, if you look at it, remains generally the same. Around 2% with pensions, around 1.5, 1.6% without pensions. However, if you look at it as percentage of the union government's expenditure, that is the total amount that gets budgeted, this year it's about 13.3% of the overall union budget. Last year, it was 13.7%. And the year before that, it was around 15.5%. So this is one area where it has been progressively decreasing. So although in real terms, in terms of the money or the funds allotted, it's been increasing the way I have mentioned to you. But in terms of percentage of union budget, the percentages are marginally declining.
How does that work? So is it because of the how do these two figures actually correlate? Before I move forward, that's something that I'd like to ask you.
Uh, which two figures?
The defense expenditure as well as the the union expenditures, the defense
See,
budget versus
uh,
the union expenditure.
see what happens is that oh, there is a certain amount that is totally budgeted. 34, 35 lakh crores is budgeted for everything, for health, education, railways, transport, everything. Out of that, the kitty, out of that whole kitty, the share that comes to defense is what I mentioned.
Hmm.
That pie that we are getting is 13.3% this year. That pie was 13.7% last year. And that pie was 15.5% year before that. So, in terms of that larger cake, uh, the size that is coming is marginally shrinking.
Shrinking, sir. That's a interesting viewpoint. And sir, when I look at the allocation versus the forces, one actually sees a decline in the army's budget, and a quite a substantial increase in the navy's budget. Now, to a layman, when he looks at it, it's a contested sort of a thing. It kind of brings up two things. One, are we looking a little more towards the maritime domain that we had failed to do in the years gone by, or is it that we found another way of equipping our army which we are not able to, I think, understand? How do you look at this entire thing, sir?
Adi, this is a very valid observation that you made. Now, uh, the figures in the budget, they speak what you have just asked me. Uh, Initially, the army last year was allotted around 36,000 crores for the capability development for the capital budget. It
Hmm.
was allotted. Now, during the revised estimates, which takes place somewhere towards the latter part of the financial year, this was downwardly revised to around 25,000 crores, a substantial reduction of about 11,000 crores. Well, this is not usual.
Hmm.
And the capital allocation again for army this year is about 32,000 crores, which is 4,000 crores less than what was allotted initially last year. And you asked if it is surprising. Yes, it is surprising because at the moment, Army is the most operationally committed service in our country. So I actually have no insight as to why and how it has happened. But as an informed onlooker like you, there could be two reasons. One, the inability of the army, or in fact, I would say the inability of the acquisition wing of our MOD to spend. I make this distinction because the financial power to any service for them to do the capital acquisition is about 300 crores, which is minuscule when you look at the major defense acquisitions. And the power beyond that for the larger substantial capital acquisitions rests with the Ministry of Defense at different levels and subsequently for the Ministry of Finance.
Hmm.
So, one is the inability to spend at whatever level. The second is, which to me would be a matter of greater concern if it has happened, due to mid course change in policy for the priority of acquisition. Uh, since about last 2 years, and now will be the third year, next financial year, about 60%, 60% plus is earmarked for indigenous acquisitions.
Yes.
And there could well be a mismatch between what was operationally required and what was domestically available,
Mhm.
because you are acquiring 60 to 70% from the domestic market. Now, in the absence of details, I don't want to be judgmental. But if this is the case, well, then I'll be more concerned about this. Now, the second part of your question was, does this indicate a conscious shift from continental to the maritime domain? Well, last year, Navy was initially allotted about 33,000 crore rupees for capital head. And where Army was reduced 11,000, the allocation for Navy was substantially increased to about 46,000 crores. And this year's allocation, 22-23, again is nearly the same, 46,000 crores. Now you look at, this is for the Navy. Now you look at the Coast Guard, there is about 60% increase in the budget of Coast Guard.
Mm.
So going by the figures, yes, there is a shift towards our capability development in the maritime domain. Now, is it a conscious decision or it has just happened? I wouldn't know, because there's no policy document in the public domain which I have had access to so far, which gives a clear focus of our priorities in continental vis-a-vis maritime domain. So this is what has happened this year.
I think only in hindsight we'll be able to analyze as to what
Exactly.
exactly the game is, sir. So,
Exactly.
the talks about this percentages and, 1.6%, 2%. There's also the figure of the glorious 3% that a lot of experts actually put out very, very strongly. Um, you know, if one looks at it, no amount is going to be ever good enough, because this technology is something that keeps growing, and there are more and more needs that come up with India's internal and external security challenges that we have in front of us. The requirements are obviously going to be there, and justifiably so. There's nothing wrong in that. My question is that a lot of people tout the figure of 3%. A lot of people say India needs to push up to about 5% for another 5 years, and then scale it back, build up the defense, build up the capability, and this and that. It's a simple question, sir. What exactly is good enough? I mean, is there a golden figure that everybody has in mind?
See, Adi, uh, you said there are experts who quote figures of 1.6, 1.3, or is there a golden figure? See, at the outset, I'm not an expert and I have no golden figure. And, a lot of figures have been quoted, 2%, 3%, 5%, or whatever you may say. See, to the best of my understanding, there is no explanation or justification today either for 1.6% that's being allotted in the budget, which I say is being apportioned as a reasonable share, or 3% being benchmarked as optimum. 1% is incidental to my mind, and 3% a reasonable approximation for capability development. So, to my mind, as we go for building our capability across multiple domains, we have to work out certain guiding factors. And that is how we'll be able to work out our capability systematically. So, uh, in that direction, what I feel is, first and foremost, we have to define what capability we want to develop and over how much period of time. Now, this long-term capability development plan, or the new nomenclature that we have, integrated capability development plan, whatever you may like to call it, you know, This has to be spread over a period of time. We should know the end state that we want to reasonably achieve in that time. And the budget allocations have to constantly, persistently match to it. Now, in practice, we have, or practically speaking, we have a lot of acquisition schemes which have already been approved by the Defense Acquisition Council, but they are languishing for years in what I would like to call is an acquisition funnel. Now, this process, which should ideally take not more than 2 to 3 years, extends much, much longer. Now, so for arriving at a particular year's budget, what one possible way could be that firstly you select the projects that have been approved by the Defense Acquisition Council, take those which have progressed substantially in the procedural aspects and which are operationally required urgently by us. Pick up that. Take that if I acquire it, how much will be the money that I'll have to pay initially, which is called the initial cash outgo. Work out what I need to pay for that. My first EMI, what do I do? Thereafter, we have certain committed liabilities of what we have purchased already.
Previous.
I mean, you have to, on your credit card, you have EMIs which you have bought already. So add to this, what is my committed liability? And thereafter, pick up certain things which you may require to acquire very urgently for building your operational capability and for mitigating the immediate threats. Now add 3 of these. This should give you the indicative capital budget. Now when it comes to the revenue side, we should know the liability of our pay. And this is for the authorized force structure that we have. We have a required force structure for Army, Navy, and Air Force, which is approved by the government, and we have a liability to pay them. Then we have to pay for the sustenance of the equipment that we have, whole lot of gamut of maintenance and all. And then there is the commitment of pensions, which is a responsibility as per the terms of engagement of the soldiers. Now, all this added should cover the overall revenue budget. Of course, this will have to be tampered with what can be apportioned at the national level against competing demands in the social sector, various development needs of the country, and what we can actually spend given during a particular financial year. Now, we need to do an India-specific exercise to work out this indicative figure. And this should be based on logic, not on perceptions or rhetoric. And in my view, our inability to follow these to factor in these requirements or to have some guiding principles towards formulation of defense budget, this is the biggest bane in capability development.
Absolutely. I think the in the olden times they used to say file latki hui hai. That's something I think that when you explain this, that's the only thing that comes to mind. And although I think what you've mentioned in terms of staggered expenses, if I may put it that way, is of capability development and procurement, obviously for anybody of my nature who doesn't know the nitty-gritties of defense procurement would not be able to understand. So whatever analysis that I would do would be on the preface of what has been written there in terms of the figures. But you've given a very different and a very accurate, a very, very accurate and interesting perspective that I think all of us must understand before we comment on that particular golden number. Thank you, sir, for that. It's always.
And let me add one more thing.
Sir,
you mentioned ये file रखी हुई है. that is a perception, and let's look at it. ये क्यों रखी हुई है?
Hmm.
The fact is, if you do not prioritize what you want, then for the person who's dealing with it, who doesn't belong to this profession, for him each file is of the same color, and he doesn't know what is a priority 1 acquisition or a priority 2
True.
acquisition.
Hmm.
So the onus of prioritizing inter-service and intra-service prioritization, this is an urgent need if we want to have a systematic spending and systematic budget allocation.
Interesting, sir. So budgets. Now you've mentioned about you've told us how defense budgets are planned in terms of their staggered expenses and so on and so forth. But having said that, there are also budgets planned for other, governmental departments or other government entities, railways, so on and so forth. There are multiple things that are planned. How different is a defense budget from one of the regular union budget sections in the entire, budgetary exercise? And there are certain perceptions which are there in terms of which are negative, as a matter of fact, uh, about the defense budget. How do you kind of put all of that into a perspective?
See, Adi, defense budget, uh, quite unlike being related to, the number of trains to be started in a particular year, or the number, or the railway tracks to be laid out, or the roads or highways to be constructed over a given period of time. Well, uh, these are related to certain specific, achievable, or certain objectives to be achieved.
Hmm.
Well, I'm not an expert on them, so I wouldn't like to comment on their process of budgeting. But then defense budgeting is different. First of all, the fundamental aspect um, we have to decide is, should the defense budget allocation be related to the capability that we want to develop, or the capability that we develop should be related to whatever defense budget has been allotted? You get my point? Okay,
How do you
I
look at?
have to
Yeah.
reach here
Hmm.
in 10 years. So therefore, I should allot these budgets. Should it be this way? Or these are the budgets being allotted, so therefore I can reach here. If these are the budgets allotted, I'll probably reach here. So this is fundamental. So when people say that the acquisition plans should be made according to the budgets allotted, well, we have to keep this distinction in mind. The second aspect, see, in a capital process is impacted by very certain uncertain acquisition timelines. I mentioned this before, which extend well beyond 2 to 3 years. That's the stipulated timeline for acquisition. And then they're subjected to a large number of imponderables of technology control by different countries. Uh, the equipment that we are trying, meeting the performance parameters actually in field trials, in high altitudes, in deserts. The issues related to IPRs,
Hmm.
contract negotiations, and various geopolitical dimensions. I mean, a country may want to give you a particular weapon and equipment at a point in time. It may not be willing to give it to you, or there may be issues of sanctions or various other
Events. Hmm.
parameters
Hmm.
related to it. So it's hard to decide as to what to align the budget to. That should, let's say we are talking of budget 22-23 today. Should this budget allocation be allotted to whatever approvals the Defense Acquisition Council will give next year, with uncertainty of when it will mature, after 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 6 years? I don't know. Or should it be related to what is likely to fructify during the current year, which at best is a reasonable guess? or should it be related to making up critical operational voids, or a mix of all this? So the problem is what to relate the defense budget to. And in response to your previous question, I had suggested a way of blending all these requirements
Mm-hmm.
of what is balance, what is most important out of that, what is your committed liability, what are your urgent operational requirements. Okay, let's blend all this, let's tamper it with whatever the country can afford, let's tamper it with whatever can pragmatically be spent during this period, and then we allot that. So this is a peculiarity of defense budget. And next, you asked about some prevailing misconceptions. Now, these misconceptions seem to be deeply embedded because every writing, every debate, one gets to hear the same issues
Same
again and again.
stories. Yes, absolutely.
Now, the standard ones. We have a very large size of standing armed forces, particularly army, and we have archaic military thinking. An army spends 80% on revenue budget for maintenance, pay, allowances, pensions, etc., etc. Now, let's understand that the force levels, each and every man that Army, Navy, or Air Force holds, is sanctioned by the government with great scrutiny. And in our context, while we talk of making lean armed forces, we have a commitment on the LC. We've seen our growing commitment on the LAC since the standoff in Eastern Ladakh. Now, in our terrain and in our environment, technology can augment, not replace manpower.
Replace. Absolutely.
It's a reality.
Hmm.
Another misconception is excessive expenditure on pay and pensions. Well, to attract a particular quality of manpower, you have to have attractive terms and conditions of service. And pensions, I mean, like any government department, it's a commitment and it's part of engagement, the terms of engagement. Uh, then sometimes the services are accused of having preference for foreign arms. Well, no, let me mention this. Having been part of the system for long, the services definitely would love to have indigenous equipment so long as it operationally performs.
Yes.
I would not like a soldier to have an assault rifle which has a stoppage in face of a terrorist or in face of an enemy. So you want a reliable equipment, and if it is available within the country, I think nobody would be more proud than the armed forces and the soldiers who are firing these. And so there are lots of misconceptions which add to this kind of a thing that these budgets are bloated, but we have to go by certain norms, we have to go by principles, and we have to go by logic. And a logic which is applicable to or which is understood by any rational person. And I've already elaborated that adequately.
Absolutely, yes, sir. So, coming to, you just mentioned a soldier would love to fire a rifle that is made in India, and there is no two questions about that. I mean, I'm from also a Fauji family, and apna hai to apna hai, and there is no question. There is a certain amount of comfort that you have with your own things. We are spending a certain amount right now into our budget in terms of indigenization. There's substantial focus on Aatmanirbharta. There's a negative list and so on and so forth. One, although it's a great thing, how do you see this evolving in the near future? And two, just a question in terms of the allocation. Is it also the factor that it will be cheaper for us to manufacture rather than import? Being the same level of technology, if I may just add that as a baseline.
Okay, to answer your last point, would what we manufacture be cheaper than what we import? See, initially no,
Mm.
because initially you have to you have to probably get technology. You have to pay for acquiring that technology. You need land. You need to create infrastructure. So all this cost has to be amortized over the equipment that would be sold. So, and you will also not have, initially, you may not have economy of numbers also, economy of scales also.
Production, yeah.
So, initially, in fact, it may turn out to be costlier than the equipment that is imported
Mm.
because they are producing in bulk at the global scale, the larger arms manufacturers. So, let's leave out the cost part of it, because self-reliance is extremely important, and we see that it impacts the nation's decision making, the strategic decision making of a nation. And today, uh, we've realized, whether it was post pandemic, where people realize the value of securing the supply chains, or today, when this conflict is going on in Ukraine, we have to think of the arms equipment that we have imported from certain countries, or the impact of secondary sanctions that may get imposed. So, to get out of all this, for a country of our stature, there is no choice. We have to become self reliant. But that's a long exercise. It has a long gestation period, particularly when we are talking of high technology. Uh, Now, in these areas, these are religiously guarded by the countries which have developed these technologies, which many a times they refer that these are our crown jewels, and we can't share them at any
Any
cost.
costs? Mm.
So, what we have to, but the biggest problem in our or with for us is to balance. On one side, we need to be operationally ready every day. We have a very unsettled security environment around us, which I don't need to repeat. So that requires operational preparedness today. If there are any capability voids, they need to be made up as of yesterday.
Mm.
However, for indigenization and our capability development, you need time. You have to research, develop, trial. There'll be inevitable failures. So for that, you need patience. So what we need to do is that we we have to we have to balance the two, and it would be best done in consultation with the services, that research and our DRDO, our research and development or process that's going on in the private sector. Now, let's take a realistic stock of it. Let's see what capabilities we need today, whatever void is there in terms of our capability, how do we bridge it? So, these are the challenges. And all these are excellent steps of negative list, of earmarking certain amount of capital expenditure for domestic industry, but at the same time, uh, it has to be implemented pragmatically,
Mm.
and like I said, in consultation with the user, with the services.
Absolutely, absolutely. You can't be throwing a negative list on the face of a service who's actually facing a threat today. If something is needed, it's needed. You just go ahead and do it. I don't think there should be any shuck in that particular aspect. Sir, coming towards the end of this, I think very interesting conversation that we're having. I'd like to actually ask you. There's a huge with the current Ukraine crisis shows us that it's not just land, sea, and air, and we are facing an enemy in China which is a master in terms of hybrid warfare. We are looking at a whole new scenario of a multi-domain sort of a setup where we need to respond to our enemies in terms of defense and as well as offense. How would you like to see this entire thing happening? How are we doing right now? Just word on that particular aspect, sir.
See, Adi, in the current day high technology threat environment, where we have this artificial intelligence driven revolution in military affairs, the warfare has expanded well beyond land, sea, and air.
Absolutely.
And cyber space, EW, psychological operations, information domain, we've all seen that. Till yesterday, they were enabling environments, but today, uh, they provide, they are a domain in themselves for which we need to prepare.
True.
Now, this preparation has to extend beyond the military alone. Well, the armed forces will remain the principal instrument of fighting, but they will have to now integrate with national level structures, whether it's the national level communication, information networks, or our technical intelligence capabilities. We have to network everything because it's a whole of a nation effort. And we are not talking of a classic delineated battlefield. So, like, let me pick up this current budget. In the speech of the finance minister, there were many aspects mentioned which have connotations related to the defense and security. For example, uh, the finance minister, she spoke about vibrant villages along our northern borders. Uh, she spoke about supportive policies for the sunrise sector, artificial intelligence, geospatial systems, space, etc. Developments in IT sector, rolling out 5G, etc. Now, each of these have defense and security application. And these all have to be stitched together because you can't have this for a particular ministry or for a particular domain and something else for defense. So, all this is defense, and defense needs all this. So, from my perspective, what I feel is that, you know, at the outset, people have repeated this any number of times that we need the national security strategy, we need the national defense strategy, in which we talk of this multi domain warfare, in which we talk of this being a whole of a nation effort. But while this comes, even a paragraph put in the finance minister's budget speech every year, linking these or stitching these things together, will at least help bring the focus of whole of the nation that this is a whole of a nation effort and defense is integral, not a separate part of this whole budget process or the whole capability development process.
I think that I'm sorry, but I'm a little lost of words. That has been put across by you in a very, very nice way. It'll help a lot of us understand the future requirements and how India needs to tackle with it, because it's not something that simple, because technology, as we all know, is evolving every single day, and there are new and new things which are coming out, and one of our adversaries seems to be at the forefront in terms of development of new technologies in terms of, for its defense. Sir, thank you so much for this enlightening discussion with regards to this thing. Before I actually let you go, I'd like to request you for a conclusion of this entire thing, and so that we can actually bring this discussion to a rounded close, if I may say so.
Okay, Adik, to conclude, let me just say that we all keep aspiring for more money, more resources. But to my mind, the aim should be to get the best value of each rupee that is allotted to us for defense. Let's visualize a future battlefield environment. How is it likely to look like? Identify the capabilities that are required, prioritize them, space them over a reasonable period of time, and then make budget allocations based on some guiding factors, balancing between operational requirements of today and self-reliance and Atmanirbharta that we ultimately require. And one aspect to balance this is that let the government consider making an allocation of, let me say, budget plus. That, okay, I've normally been giving this much for the defense budget. Let me add something more so that defense sector works as a vehicle for industrial growth, and it helps in operational preparedness. And this budget plus that is given helps the industry in getting its feet, helping us indigenize, helping us develop our indigenous equipment and get our indigenous technology. So a marginal increase will strengthen our defense capability as well as strengthen our defense industrial base in particular. Well, that's how I would sum up this from my side.
I'll being from a predominantly a sales background, if I may say, so it'll also earn us quite a buck. We'll be able to sell it. So an expense could turn into a little bit of a revenue. I don't think that's going to be much of a this thing. So once again, thank you so much for taking us through India's defense budget. Certain shortfalls, certain positives, and of course the concept of civil military fusion that you brought out very, very nicely in the last question, in the last answer that you gave us. Till next time, sir, for another subject and another day. Jai Hind.
Thank you, Adi. Pleasure being with you. Jai Hind.
Thank you, sir.